This session will cover the anatomy of the olfactory eye and part of the ear. So let's get started. Let's first start with the olfactory system. This diagram here shows the main functions of the olfactory system. So the main functions include smelling, which is sensory perception, also tasting, which is flavor perception, although it's not really tasting, but it's getting a feel for what something could taste like. And then these are connected to your emotional and memory responses. So it's connected to the limbic system to cause emotions and memory, so that if you have a smell that reminds you of a certain food, and then you remember that. It's also connected to the amygdala and hippocampus. So you can get happy emotions or even not so happy emotions when you remember how something tastes. It's also important for some social interaction by sensing pheromones and other smells. And this can also influence behavior. And this is one of the few areas in the brain, in the central nervous system, where you can form new neurons or neurogenesis. So this picture here shows the typical cells of the olfactory system right here with the olfactory bulb. It's directly connected to the CNS, unlike other cranial nerves. And it has this cells with the mucus and the cilia and the sensory mechanisms. This then will interact with many areas in the limbic system, the thalamus, hippocampus, and amygdala, as mentioned. This particular slide now shows in more detail how that olfactory bulb is linked to the mucosa. So the olfactory bipolar neurons, which is further down, are the primary afferents. They express products of several hundred olfactory genes, and this forms the neurons from the olfactory nerve. So above them are the substangular cells, which are the supporting cells. And these help transmit the signals from these olfactory cilia to the olfactory neurons. The basal cells help replace any of the neurons that degenerate and turn over. So the olfactory bulb then receives the signal and it directly transmits this to the olfactory cortex. On the bottom, there's a histology slide showing how each of these cells look on a slide. Now let's switch gears to the eye. So this is just going to give a general overview of the eye. There will be future sessions, lectures, which will cover the eye in more detail. But since this is just from the initial anatomy, we're just going to do an overview. So the eye has a fibrous tunic area. It's a very dense wall that's protecting the eye. And this is made up of two layers. The sclera, which is the white part of the eye, and then it's continuous with the cornea, which is transparent, and it's also the anterior part of the eye responsible for refraction. So the main job of the cornea is to focus that light to create a clear image. It also covers the iris and the pupil. Moving further along, the iris, which is part of the vascular part of the eye, this is the pigmented part or the colored part of our eye, and this adjusts the pupil size through some muscular contraction. There is then a ciliary body, which comprises of two things, a ciliary process, which produces the aqueous humor fluid, and the ciliary muscle, which controls the lens shape. And then the choroid is a vascular membrane that connects connective tissue and blood cells, as shown here in red in this picture. And this is what is bringing the nutrition to the eye with the blood system, bringing in nutrients directly into the different components. Moving on back to the further back now, the retina, which is this yellow layer here. This is the innermost layer of the eye, and this is what captures that light, that signal coming through the lens, and transmits this directly to the optic nerve shown in the back of this diagram. There are also two fluid chambers to provide lubrication for all of these and to maintain a certain pressure here too. The anterior chamber is between the cornea and the iris, and this is filled with aqueous humor produced by the ciliary body. The posterior chamber is between the iris and the lens, and this is communicating with the anterior chamber, so fluid can freely flow between these two chambers. The vitreous chamber is between the lens and the retina, and this also contains the vitreous humor, shown here in the very back. We will talk in future lectures about abnormalities that happen in each of these components to cause conditions like glaucoma. Okay, so back to the middle ear again. The auditory ossicles are shown here with the malleus, incus, and stapes that transmits the vibratory motion from the tympanic membrane to the inner ear. Once that signal gets to the inner ear, there is a signal, or there is a system called the tensor tympani, which is innervated by some of the cranial nerves, cranial nerve 5 and cranial nerve 7. And this dampens the sound waves in response to loud noise. Looking further at these auditory ossicles in the inner ear, we have the bony labyrinth, which is the cochlea, the vestibule, and the semicircular canals. Then there's the membranous labyrinth, which is the systems of sacs and ducts with the bony labyrinth. And that's what the endolymph is in. That's where the liquid is in. So we'll now talk about the conduction from the hearing and then also the vestibular system, which are the two main parts of this inner ear. So as far as sound conduction, vibrations from the tympanic membrane will activate those three bones, and then that will create a vibration here at the basilar membrane. Higher frequency sounds are usually detected closer to the base of the cochlea because there's a narrower membrane there, whereas lower frequency sounds are usually near the apex of the cochlea because there's a wider membrane there. Once this sound gets detected, the vibrations then are facilitated by the organ of Corti, which is in the inner ear. This movement of the hair cells of the spiral organ here will then open and close the membrane channels, as shown here. This combined activity of the hair loss then converts this mechanical energy into an electrochemical energy, and that is now sensed through the cochlear nerve, which makes its way to the brain. So this organ of Corti is shown here as a cross-section from the inner side of the inner ear. You can see here the different nerve fibers and all the cells that are involved with this process. So now let's go to the vestibular complex, vestibular system. The vestibular system is also a complicated process in the sense of it's an interplay between the hair follicles, the receptors in the saccule and the utricle, which then respond to your head position. The saccule is responsible for linear motion, in the vertical plane, and the utricle is responsible in the horizontal plane, so it detects forward or backward acceleration. Looking at this a little further, to maintain equilibrium, these semicircular canals, they detect the pitch, which is what happens when your head moves up and down. The lateral semicircular canals will detect what's called the yaw, which is when your head moves from side to side. And then the posterior semicircular canal will be responsible for the roll, which is when you lean your head towards the shoulder or when you do a cartwheel. Each of these with otoliths moving in, when you do these motions, it activates these hair bundles and these hair cells. And that will eventually activate the vestibulocochlear nerve, which gets these signals. The cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve is involved with more hearing from the cochlea. The vestibular nerve from the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve 8, is what innervates this utricle, saccule, and semicircular canals, and that is what regulates the equilibrium, the balance between our right ear and our left ear, and the signaling that is coming from both sides and interpreted by the brain. This concludes the session on this anatomy session. Please subscribe to ACM at the YouTube channel for more updates and to see these videos there too.